Chapter 2 of The Pirates of Ersatz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pirates of Ersatz by Murray Leinster. Chapter 2. In something under 2 hours, Hoddan was ushered into the ambassador's office. He'd been refreshed, his torn clothing replaced by more respectable garments, and the places where stun pistols had stung him soothed by ointments. But more important, he'd worked out and firmly adopted a new point of view. He'd been a misfit at home on Zan because he was not contented with the humdrum and monotonous life of a member of a space pirate community. Piracy was a matter of dangerous takeoffs in cranky rocket ships, to be followed by weeks or months of tedious and uncomfortable boredom in highly unhealthy rebreathed air. No voyage ever contained more than 10 seconds of satisfactory action, and all space fighting took place just out of the atmosphere of a possibly embattled planet, because you couldn't intercept a ship at cruising speed between the stars. Regardless of the result of the fighting, one had to get away fast when it was over, lest overwhelming force swarm up from a nearby world. It was intolerably devoid of anything an ambitious young man could want. Even when one had made a good prize, with the lifeboat starting frantically for ground, and after one got back to Zan with a captured ship, even then there was little satisfaction in a piratical career. Zan had not a large population. Piracy couldn't support a large number of people. Zan couldn't attempt to defend itself against even singly heavily armed ships that sometimes came in passionate resolve to avenge the disappearance of a rich freighter or a fast new liner. So the people of Zan, to avoid hanging, had to play innocent. They had to be convincingly simple, harmless folk who cultivated their fields and led quiet, blameless lives. They might loot, but they had to hide their booty where investigators could not find it. They couldn't really benefit by it. They had to build their own houses and make their own garments and grow their own food, so life on Zan was dull. Piracy was not profitable in the sense that one could live well by it. It simply wasn't a trade for a man like Hoddan. So he'd abandoned it. He'd studied electronics in books from looted passenger ship libraries. Within months after arrival on a law-abiding planet, he was able to earn a living in electronics as an honest trade. And that was unsatisfactory. Law-abiding communities were no more thrilling or rewarding than piratical ones. A payday now and then didn't make up for the tedium of labor. Even when one had money, there wasn't much to do with it. On Walden, to be sure, the level of civilization was so high that many people needed psychiatric treatment to stand it, and neurotics vastly outnumbered more normal folk. And on Walden, electronics was only a trade like piracy, and no more fun. He should have known it would be this way. His grandfather had often discussed this frustration in human life. "Us humans," it was his grandfather's habit to say, "don't make sense. There's some of us that work so hard they get too tired to enjoy life. There's some that work so hard at enjoying it they don't get no fun out of it. And the rest of us spend our lives complaining there ain't no fun in it anyhow. The man that overall has the best time of any is one that picks out something he hasn't got a chance to do, and spends his life raising hell because he stopped from doing it. When," and here Hoddan's grandfather tended to be emphatic, "he wouldn't think much of it if he could." What Hoddan craved, of course, was a sense of achievement, of doing things worth doing and doing them well. Technically, there were opportunities all around him. He'd developed one, and it would save millions of credits a year if it were adopted. But nobody wanted it. He tried to force its use. He was in trouble, and now he could complain justly enough. But despite his grandfather, he was not the happiest man he knew. The ambassador received him with a cordial wave of the hand. "Things move fast," he said cheerfully. "You weren't here half an hour before there was a police captain at the gate. He explained that an excessively dangerous criminal had escaped jail and been seen to climb the embassy wall. He offered very generously to bring some men in and capture you and take you away, with my permission, of course. He was shocked when I declined." "I can understand that," said Hoddan. By the way, said the ambassador, young men like yourself, is there a girl involved in this? Hoddan considered. A girl's father, he acknowledged, is the real complainant against me. Does he complain, asked the ambassador, because you want to marry her, or because you don't? Neither, Hoddan told him. She hasn't quite decided that I'm worth defying her rich father for. Good, said the ambassador. It can't be too bad a mess while a woman is being really practical. I've checked your story. Allowing for differences of viewpoint, it agrees with the official version. I've ruled that you're a political refugee, and so entitled to sanctuary in the embassy, and that's that. Thank you, sir, said Hoddan. There's no question about the crime, observed the ambassador, or that it is primarily political. You propose to improve a technical process in a society which considers itself beyond improvement. If you'd succeeded, the idea of change would have spread. People now poor would have gotten rich. People now rich would have gotten poor. And you'd have done what all governments are established to prevent. So you'll never be able to walk the streets of this planet again in safety. You've scared people. Yes, sir, said Hoddan. It's been an unpleasant surprise to them, to be scared. The ambassador put the tips of his fingers together. Do you realize, he asked, that the whole purpose of civilization is to take the surprises out of life, so one can be bored to death? That a culture in which nothing unexpected ever happens is in what is called its golden age? That when nobody can even imagine anything happening unexpectedly, that they later fondly refer to that period as the good old days? I hadn't thought of it in just those words, sir. It's one of the most avoided facts of life, said the ambassador. Government, in the local or planetary sense of the word, is an organization for the suppression of adventure. Taxes are, in part, the insurance premiums one pays for protection against the unpredictable. And you have offended against everything that is the foundation of a stable and orderly and damnably tedious way of life. Against civilization, in fact. Hoddan frowned. Yet you've granted me asylum. Naturally, said the ambassador. The diplomatic service works for the welfare of humanity. That doesn't mean stuffiness. A golden age in any civilization is always followed by collapse. In ancient days, savages came and camped outside the walls of super-civilized towns. They were unwashed, unmannerly, and unsanitary. Super-civilized people refused to even think about them. So presently the savages stormed the city walls, and another civilization went up in flames. But now, objected Hoddan, there are no savages. They invent themselves, the ambassador told him. My point is that the diplomatic service cherishes individuals and causes which battle stuffiness and complacency, and golden ages, and monstrous things like that. Not thieves, of course, they're degradation like body lice. But rebels and crackpots and revolutionaries who prevent hardening of the arteries of commerce and furnish wholesome exercise to the body politic. They're worth cherishing. I think I see, sir, said Hoddan. I hope you do, said the ambassador. My action on your behalf is pure diplomatic policy. To encourage the dissatisfied is to ensure against universal satisfaction, which is lethal. Walden is in a bad way. You're the most encouraging thing that has happened here in a long time. And you're not a native. No, agreed Hoddan. I come from Zan. Never mind. The ambassador turned to a stellar atlas. Consider yourself a good symptom, and valued as such. If you could start a contagion, you deserve well of your fellow citizens. Savages can always invent themselves. But enough of apology from me. Let us set about your affairs. He consulted the atlas. Where would you like to go, since you must leave Walden? Not too far, sir. The girl, eh? The ambassador did not smile. He ran his finger down a page. The nearest inhabited worlds, of course, are Krim and Darth. Krim is a place of lively commercial activity, where an electronics engineer should find easy employment. It's said to be progressive there and has much organized research." "I wouldn't want to be a kept engineer, sir," said Hoddan apologetically. "I'd rather, well, putter on my own." "Impractical, but sensible," commented the ambassador. He turned a page. "There's Darth. Its social system is practically feudal. It's technically backward. There's a landing grid, but space exports are skins and metal ingots and practically nothing else. There is no broadcast power. Strangers find local customs difficult. There's no town larger than 20,000 people. Few approach that size. Most settled places are mere villages near some feudal castle, and roads are so few and bad that wheel transport is rare." He leaned back and said in a detached voice, "I had a letter from there a couple of months ago. It was rather arrogant. The writer was one Don Loris, and he explained that his dignity would not let him make a commercial offer, but an electronics engineer who put himself under his protection would not be the loser. He signed himself Prince of this, Lord of that, Baron of the other thing, and claimant to the dukedom of something else. Are you interested? No kings on Darth, just feudal chiefs." Hoddan thought it over. "I'll go to Darth," he decided. "It's bound to be better than Zan, and it can't be worse than Walden." The ambassador looked impassive. An embassy servant came in and offered an indoor communicator. The ambassador put it to his ear. After a moment he said, "Show him in." "You did kick up a storm. The Minister of State, no less, is here to demand your surrender. I'll counter with a formal request for an exit permit. I'll talk to you again when he leaves." Hoddan went out. He paced up and down the other room into which he was shown. Darth wouldn't be in a golden age. He was wiser now than he'd been this same morning. He recognized that he'd made mistakes. Now he could see rather ruefully how completely improbable it was that anybody could put across a technical device merely by proving its value, without making anybody want it. He shook his head regretfully at the blunder. The ambassador sent for him. "I've had a pleasant time," he told Hoddan genially. "There was a beautiful row. You've really scared people, Hoddan. You deserve well of the Republic. Every government and every person needs to be thoroughly terrified occasionally. It limbers up the brain." "Yes, sir," said Hoddan. "The planetary government," said the ambassador with relish, "insists that you have to be locked up with the key thrown away, because you know how to make death rays. I said it was nonsense and you were a political refugee in sanctuary. The Minister of State said the cabinet would consider removing you forcibly from the embassy if you weren't surrendered. I said that if the embassy was violated, no ship would clear for Walden from any other civilized planet. They wouldn't like losing their off-planet trade. Then he said that the government would not give you an exit permit and that he would hold me personally responsible if you killed everybody on Walden, including himself and me. I said he insulted me by suggesting I'd permit such shenanigans. He said the government would take an extremely grave view of my attitude, and I said they would be silly if they did. Then he went off with great dignity, but shaking with panic, to think up more nonsense." "Evidently," said Hoddan in relief, "you believe me when I say that my gadget doesn't make death rays." The ambassador looked slightly embarrassed. "To be honest," he admitted, "I've no doubt that you invented it independently, but they've been using such a device for half a century in the Cetus cluster. They've had no trouble." Hoddan winced. "Did you tell the minister that?" "Hardly," said the ambassador. "It would have done you no good. You're in open revolt and have performed over acts of violence against the police. But it was also impolite enough for me to suggest that a local government was stupid. It would have been most undiplomatic to prove it." Hoddan did not feel proud just then. "I'm thinking that the cops, quite unofficially, might try to kidnap me from the embassy. They'll deny that they tried, especially if they manage it, but I think they'll try." "Very likely," said the ambassador. "We'll take precautions." "I'd like to make something, not lethal, just in case," said Hoddan. "If you can trust me not to make death rays, I'd like to make a generator of odd-shaped microwaves. They're described in textbooks. They ionize the air where they strike, that's all. They make air a high-resistance conductor. Nothing more than that." The ambassador said, "There was an old-fashioned way to make ozone." When Hoddan nodded, a little surprised, the ambassador said, "By all means, go ahead. You should be able to get parts from your room vision receiver. I'll have some tools given you." Then he added, "Diplomacy has to understand the things that control events. Once it was a social position. For a time it was weapons. Then it was commerce. Now it's technology. But I wonder how you'll use ionization of air to protect yourself from kidnappers. Don't tell me. I'd rather try to guess." He waved his hand in cordial dismissal, and an embassy servant showed Hoddan to his quarters. 10 minutes later, another staff man brought him tools such as would be needed for work on a vision set. He was left alone. He delicately disassembled the set in his room and began to put some of the parts together in a novel but wholly rational fashion. The science of electronics, like the science of mathematics, had progressed away beyond the point where all of it had practical applications. One could spend a lifetime learning things that research had discovered in the past, and industry had never found a use for. On Zan, industriously reading pirated books, Hoddan hadn't known where utility stopped. He'd kept on learning long after a practical man would have stopped studying to get a paying job. Any electronic engineer could have made the device he now assembled. It only needed to be wanted, and apparently he was the first person to want it. In this respect, it was like the receptor that had gotten him into trouble, but as he put the small parts together, he felt a certain loneliness. A man Hoddan's age needs to have some girl admire him from time to time. If Nedda had been sitting cross-legged before him, listening raptly while he explained, Hoddan would probably have been perfectly happy. But she wasn't. It wasn't likely she ever would be. Hoddan scowled. Inside of an hour, he'd made a hand-sized 5-watt waveguide projector of waves of eccentric form. In the beam of that projector, air became ionized. Air became a high-resistance conductor comparable to nichrome wire, when and where the projector sent its microwaves. He was wrapping tape about the pistol grip when a servant brought him a scribbled note. It had been handed in at the embassy gate by a woman who fled after leaving it. It looked like Nedda's handwriting. It read like Nedda's phrasing. It appeared to have been written by somebody in a highly emotional state. But it wasn't quite, not absolutely, convincing. He went to find the ambassador and handed over the note. The ambassador read it and raised his eyebrows. "Well?" "It could be authentic," admitted Hoddan. "In other words," said the ambassador, "you're not sure it's a booby trap? An invitation to a date with the police?" "I'm not sure," said Hoddan. "I think I'd better bite. If I have any illusions left after this morning, I'd better find it out. I thought Nedda liked me quite a lot." "I make no comment," observed the ambassador. "Can I help you in any way?" "I have to leave the embassy," said Hoddan. "And there's practically solid line of police outside the walls. Could I borrow some old clothes, a few pillows, and a length of rope?" Half an hour later, a rope uncoiled itself at the very darkest outside corner of the embassy wall. It dangled down to the ground. This was at the rear of the embassy enclosure. The night was bright with stars, and the city's towers glittered with many lights. But here there was almost complete blackness and that silence of a city which is sometimes so companionable. The rope remained hanging from a wall. No light reached the ground there. The tiny crescent of Walden's farthest moon cast an insufficient glow. Nothing could be seen by it. The rope went up, as if it had been lowered merely to make sure it was long enough for its purpose. Then it descended again. This time a figure dangled at its end. It came down, swaying a little. It reached the blackest part of the shadow at the wall's base. It stayed there. Nothing happened. The figure rose swiftly, hauled up in rapid pullings of the rope. Then the line came down again, and again a figure descended. But this figure moved. The rope swayed and oscillated. The figure came down a good halfway to the ground. It paused, and then descended with much movement to 2/3 of the way from the top. There, something seemed to alarm it. It began to rise with violent writhings of the rope. It climbed. There was a crackling noise. A stun pistol. The figure seemed to climb more frantically. More cracklings. Half a dozen sharp, snapping noises. They were stun pistol charges and there were tiny sparks where they hit. The dangling figure seemed convulsed. It went limp, but it did not fall. More charges poured into it. It hung motionless halfway up the wall of the embassy. Movements began in the darkness. Men appeared, talking in low tones and straining their eyes toward the now motionless figure. They gathered underneath it. One went off at a run, carrying a message. Someone of authority arrived, panting. There was more low-toned argument. More and still more men appeared. There were 40 or 50 figures at the base of the wall. One of those figures began to climb the rope hand over hand. He reached the motionless object. He swore in a shocked voice. He was shushed from below. He let the figure drop. It made next to no sound when it landed. There was a rushing as the guards about the embassy went furiously back to their proper posts to keep anybody from slipping out. 2 men remained swearing bitterly over a dummy made of old clothes and pillows. But their profanity was in vain. Hoddan was then some blocks away. He suffered painful doubt about the note ostensibly from Netta. The guards about the embassy would have tried to catch him in any case, but it did seem very plausible that the note had been sent him to get him to try to get down the wall. On the other hand, a false descent of a palpably dummy-like dummy had been plausible too. He'd drawn all the guards to one spot by his seeming doubt and by testing out their vigilance with a dummy. The only thing improbable in his behavior had been that after testing their vigilance with a dummy, he'd made use of it. A fair distance away, he turned sedately into a narrow lane between buildings. This paralleled another lane serving the home of a girlfriend of Netta's. The note had named the garden behind that other girl's home as a rendezvous. But Hoddan was not going to that garden. He wanted to make sure. If the cops had forged the note... He judged his position carefully. If he climbed this tree... Kind of the city planners of Walden to use trees so lavishly. If he climbed this tree, he could look into the garden where Netta, in theory, waited in tears. He climbed it. He sat astride a thick limb in scented darkness and considered further. Presently, he brought out his 5-watt projector. There was deepest darkness hereabouts. Trees and shrubbery were merely blacker than their surroundings. But there was reason for suspicion. Neither in the house of Netta's girlfriend, nor in the nearer house between, was there a single lighted window. Hoddan adjusted the waveguide and pressed the stud of his instrument. He pointed it carefully into the nearer garden. A man grunted in surprised tone. There was stirring. A man swore startledly. The word seemed inappropriate to a citizen merely breathing the evening air. Hoddan frowned. The note from Netta seemed to have been a forgery. To make sure, he readjusted the waveguide to project a thin but fan-shaped beam. He aimed again. Painstakingly, he traversed the area in which men would have been posted to jump him, in the event that the note was forged. If Netta were there, she would feel no effect. If police lay in wait, they would notice, at once. They did. A man howled. 2 men yelled together. Somebody bellowed. Somebody squealed. Someone in charge of the flares made ready to give light for the police was so startled by a strange sensation that he jerked the cord. An immense cold white brilliance appeared. The garden where Netta definitely was not present became bathed in incandescence. Light spilled over the wall of one garden into the next and disclosed a squirming mass of police in the near garden also. Some of them leaped wildly and ungracefully while clawing behind them. Some stood still and struggled desperately to accomplish something to their rear, while others gazed blankly at them until Hoddan swung his instrument their way also. A man tore off his pants and swarmed over the wall to get away from something intolerable. Others imitated him, save in the direction of their flight. Some removed their trousers before they fled, but others tried to get them off while fleeing. Those last did not fare too well. Mostly they stumbled and other men fell over them, when both fallen and fallen upon uttered hoarse and profane lamentations. They howled to the high heavens. Hoddan let the confusion mount past any unscrambling. and then slid down the tree and joined in the rush. With the glare in the air behind him, he only feigned to stumble over one figure after another. Once he grunted as he scorched his own fingers, but he came out of a lane with a dozen stun pistols, mostly uncomfortably warm, as trophies of the ambush. As they cooled off, he stowed them away in his belt and pockets, strolling away down the tree-lined street. Behind him, cops realized their trouserless condition and appealed plaintively to householders to notify headquarters of their state. Hoddan did not feel particularly disillusioned somehow. It occurred to him even that this particular event was likely to help him getting off Walden. If he was to leave against the cops' will, he needed to have them at less than top efficiency. And men who have had their pants scorched off them are not apt to think too clearly. Hoddan felt a certain confidence increase in his mind. He'd worked the thing out very nicely. If ionization made a high-resistance conductor, then an ionizing beam would make a high-resistance short between the power terminals of a stun pistol. With the power a stun pistol carried, that short would get hot. So would the pistol. It would get hot enough, in fact, to scorch cloth in contact with it, which had happened. If the effect had been produced in the soles of policemen's feet, Hoddan would have given every cop a hotfoot. But since they carried their stun pistols in their hip pockets, the thought of Nedda diminished his satisfaction. The note could be pure forgery, or the police could have learned about it through the treachery of the servant she sent to the embassy with it. It would be worthwhile to know. He headed toward the home of her father. If she were loyal to him, why, it would complicate things considerably. But he felt it necessary to find out. He neared the spot where Nedda lived. This was an especially desirable residential area. The houses were large and gracefully designed, and the gardens were especially lush. Presently he heard music ahead. Live music. He went on. He came to a place where strolling citizens had paused under the trees of the street to listen to the melody and the sound of voices that accompanied it. And the music and the festivity was in the house in which Nedda dwelt. She was having a party, on the very night of the day in which he'd been framed for life imprisonment. It was a shock. Then there was a rush of vehicles, and police trucks were disgorging cops before the door. They formed a cordon about the house, and some knocked and were admitted in haste. Then Hoddan nodded dourly to himself. His escape from the embassy was now known. No less certainly, the failure of the trap Nedda's note had baited had been reported. The police were now turning the whole city into a trap for one Bron Hoddan. And they were looking first at the most probable places. Then they'd search the possible places for him to be. And by the time that had been accomplished, they'd have cops from other cities pouring into the city, and they'd search every square inch of it for him. And certainly and positively they'd take the most urgent and infallible precautions to make sure he didn't get back into the embassy. It was a situation that would have appalled Hoddan only that morning. Now, though, he only shook his head sadly. He moved on. He'd gotten into trouble by trying to make an industrial civilization accept something it didn't want. A technical improvement in a standard electronic device. He'd gotten partly out of trouble by giving his jailers what they definitely desired. The sight of him apparently a suicide in the cell of the detention building. He'd come out of the embassy again by giving the watchers outside a view they urgently desired. A figure secretly descending the embassy wall. He'd indulged himself at the ambuscade, but the way to get back into the embassy. It was not far from Nedda's house to a public safety kiosk, decoratively placed on a street corner. He entered it. It was unattended, of course. It was simply an out-of-door installation where cops could be summoned or fires reported or emergencies described by citizens independently of the regular home communicators. It had occurred to Hoddan that the planetary authorities would be greatly pleased to hear of a situation in a place that would seem to hint at his presence. There were all sorts of public services that would be delighted to operate impressively in their own lines. There were bureaus which would rejoice in a chance to show off their efficiency. He used his microwave generator, which at short enough range would short-circuit anything, upon the apparatus in the kiosk. It was perfectly simple, if one knew how. He worked with a sort of tender thoroughness, shorting this item, shorting that, giving this frantic emergency call, stating that baseless lie. When he went back out of the kiosk, he walked briskly towards an appointment he had made. And presently the murmur of the city at night had new sound added to it. They began as a faint, confused clamor at the edges of the city. The uproar moved centralward and grew louder as it came. There were clanging bells and sirens and beeper horns warning all non-official vehicles to keep out of the way. On the raised-up expressway, snorting metal monsters rushed with squealing excitement. On the fragrant lesser streets, small vehicles rushed with proportionately louder howlings. Police trucks poured out of their cubbyholes and plunged valiantly through the dark. Broadcast units signaled emergency and cut off the air to make the placid ether waves available to authority. All these noises and all this tumult moved toward a single point. The outer parts of the city regained their former quiet, save that there was less music. The broadcasts were off. But the sound of racing vehicles clamoring for right-of-way grew louder and louder, and more peremptory as it concentrated toward the large open square on which the Interstellar Embassy faced. From every street and avenue, firefighting equipment poured into the square. In between and behind, hooting loudly for precedence, police trucks accompanied and foreran them. Emergency vehicles of all the civic bureaus appeared, all of them with immense conviction of their importance. It was a very large open square, that space before the embassy. From its edge, the monument to the first settlers in the center looked small. But even that vast plaza filled up with trucks of every imaginable variety, from the hose towers which would throw streams of water 400 feet straight up, to the miniature troubled wagons of electrical supply. Staff cars of fire and police and sanitary services crowded each other and bumped fenders with tree-surgeon trucks prepared to move fallen trees, and with public address trucks ready to lend stentorian tones to any voice of authority. But there was no situation except that there was no situation. There was no fire. There was no riot. There was not even stray dogs for the pound wagons to pursue, nor broken water mains for the water department technicians to shut off and repair. There was nothing for anybody to do but ask everybody else what the hell they were doing there, and presently to swear at each other for cluttering up the way. The din of arriving horns and sirens had stopped, and a mutter of profanity was developing, when at last a vehicle arrived. It was an ambulance, and it came purposefully out of a side avenue and swung toward a particular place as if it knew exactly what it was about. When its way was blocked, it hooted impatiently for passage. Its lights blinked violently red, demanding clearance. A giant firefighting unit pulled aside. The ambulance ran past and hooted at a cluster of police trucks. They made way for it. It blared at a gathering of dismounted, irritated truck personnel. It made its way through them. It moved in a straight line for the gate of the Interstellar Embassy. 100 yards from that gate, its horn blatted irritably at the car of the acting head of municipal police. That car obediently made way for it. The ambulance rolled briskly up to the very gate of the embassy. There it stopped. A figure got down from the driver's seat and walked purposefully in the gate. Thereafter, nothing happened at all, until a second figure rolled and toppled itself out on the ground from the seat beside the ambulance driver's. That figure kicked and writhed on the ground. A policeman went to find out what was the matter. It was the ambulance driver. Not the one who'd driven the ambulance to the embassy gate, but the one who should have. He was bound, hand and foot, and not too tightly gagged. When released, he swore vividly while panting that he'd been captured and bound by somebody who said he was Bron Hoddan, and was in a hurry to get back to the Interstellar Embassy. There was no uproar. Those to whom Hoddan's name had meaning were struck speechless with rage. The fury of the police was even too deep for tears. But Bron Hoddan, back in the quarters assigned him in the embassy, unloaded a dozen cooled-off stun pistols from his pockets and sent word to the ambassador that he was back, and that the note ostensibly from Nedda had actually been a police trap. Getting ready to retire, he reviewed his situation. In some respects, it was not too bad. All but Nedda's share in trying to trap him, and having a party the same night. He stared morosely at the wall. Then he saw, very simply, that she mightn't have known even of his arrest. She lived a highly sheltered life. Her father could have had her kept completely in ignorance. He cheered immediately. This would be his last night on Walden, if he were lucky, but vague plans already revolved in his mind. Yes, he'd achieve splendid things. He'd grow rich. He'd come back and marry that delightful girl Nedda, and end as a great man. Already today, he'd done a number of things worth doing, and on the whole, he'd done them well. End of chapter 2.